So, Denis Meadows, thank you very much for sharing your time. Okay, we're facing many issues right now. One is, of course, climate change and the biodiversity or energy situation. So not only one problem, but we're facing many problems right now. So how we can deal with such a combination of problems, or how we can see the situation so that we can come up with the more effective solutions to these issues? How do you see the current situation?
In Japan, you have enough money and enough intellect to find satisfactory solutions for these problems, but it will take that you look at them in a different way. You need to think not about the next few years, but about the next decades, because we are now engaged in a process of transition, which is going to evolve over 30 or 50 years or more. And anyone who tries to find a quick solution won't succeed, and maybe even will pick the wrong answer. A second thing is to realize there's no magic button which you can push and solve all these problems. It's going to be a very difficult, complex task to take our society over into a new situation where it is in balance with the environment and where, once again, these problems are manageable. Of course, we never come to a situation where we don't have problems. There always will be problems, but at least we hope that they wouldn't threaten our species.
From the perspective of the outsider to Japan, how do you see the Japanese situation? Because to my knowledge, I mean, Japanese people just have climate change on their agenda. So, of course, you know, the midterm goal of 25% reduction by 2020, that would be great. But at the same time, we have to have the very low energy self-sufficiency rate, for example. So from outsider perspective, how do you see the Japan as a whole, and what are our weaknesses, or what we have to think about that?
It's important to understand that the global system, where of course Japan is tightly integrated into it, is going to go through a period of enormous change. We will see in the global system over the next 20 years more change politically, environmentally, technically than in the last 100, or in the specific case of Japan. Probably the difference between Japan in 1850, before Commodore Perry came, and today, that difference, which is of course enormous, is less than the difference between Japan now and Japan 30 or 40 years in the future.
Wow.
So when you start to think about these issues, it is a mistake to try and find solutions that would work under current circumstances, because the current circumstances are going to disappear. What's going to produce this change? Well, of course, climate change is going to be a very strong factor, but also energy. There is excellent scientific evidence that global oil production has already peaked out. It doesn't mean we're running out of oil. Of course, there will always be a lot of oil in the ground. But in order to get benefit from the oil, you have to produce it. You have to pump it out and ship it. And there's good evidence that the amount we produce is now starting to go down for a variety of reasons. And we are fundamentally dependent on oil for transportation, in many parts of the world for electricity and space heat and so forth. So when that oil starts to fall down, it reduces our possibilities to deal with other issues as well. Japan is very fortunate in one respect. You are an island nation with a relatively homogeneous culture and a coherent history. I couldn't say that about the United States, for example. We are a continental nation, and we have an enormous diversity of cultures and so forth. Why is it an advantage for Japan? When you have to make big changes, it's much easier to do that if the people share a common vision and a common value set. In my country, for example, in many parts of Europe now, the diversity is so great that no matter what you want to do, there's always going to be somebody who's against it. And since it's much easier to block something than to make it happen, the result is just paralysis. So that's an advantage for Japan. Also, Japan is very rich. I mean, I realize that recently there has been this big news story about the China GDP is now bigger than the Japan GDP. I mean, but this is just silly. China has 10 times more people than Japan. The GDP per person in Japan is maybe 7 or 8 times the GDP per person in China. And so when you start to think about who has the resources for dealing with these problems, obviously Japan is in an enormously much better situation.
So you talked about peak oil situation, and the Japan is very dependent on the oil. I think among the primary energy, we have 44% or something like that for oil, and the fossil fuel we have more than 80% dependency. So we have to change that situation. So when you talk about the peak oil and the other energy situation, where can we see the solutions way out?
So again, there's no one solution. The first thing is to realize that we are now, globally, we are in a period where oil production is going to start falling. And although Japan has done quite a good job of producing, let's say, electricity without using oil, nonetheless your transportation fleet is almost totally dependent on oil. I can tell you from my own scientific studies that there is absolutely no possibility whatsoever that efficiency measures and renewable energy will compensate for the reduction of oil. The global system, which has become used to ever-growing use of energy, now faces, for the foreseeable future, ever-declining sources of energy. And so the second thing is to start thinking about where in your society you get the most benefit from energy, where it's not very productive actually, and to begin making preparations for the change. Japan has practically no fossil fuels. So if you think about what can you do, you have wind, potentially, not very well developed yet. Some possibilities for solar, sun energy, particularly important at a decentralized level where storage is not so difficult. And you have geothermal. I know geothermal poses all sorts of difficulties with local hot bath owners and so forth. But it just means that there needs to be some reassessment of the social costs and benefits of different possibilities. Using oil has enormous disadvantages for your society too. The difference is that they aren't in somebody's backyard. They're over there, and so everybody prefers that the cost should be over there instead of here. So this needs to be understood. One advantage that Japan has is great engineering expertise. Every country is going to have to develop so-called smart grid. Even in a time of declining energy, you need to make extremely effective use of the energy you have, and you need to have the capacity for changing who's going to get this energy, what they're going to use it for. That requires a smart grid. It's an enormously expensive, technically challenging problem, and there Japan is already a leader, and it's an area which could produce great benefits at home and also very important export markets.
So as you said, we are accustomed to the expansion of the energy use in the past, but we have to face the declining energy situation in the future. So what will happen? I mean, the people are not ready for that, and the first signal would be the price of energy, and how can we see the situation in the future?
I spend a lot of time trying to understand how this energy decline is actually going to unfold in a practical way. Of course, in Japan, you will soon have declining population. It's perfectly reasonable to imagine that if your population is going down, that your energy consumption could go down. So in a way, this declining population is a great advantage for you in that connection. We can start from the very simple fact that you can't use what you don't have.
Yes.
So we don't know exactly how the energy will be allocated, but we know that what is allocated, the total will be going down. How can it be allocated? Well, one is price. I don't think price is going to be so important for two reasons. First of all, now the majority of oil reserves are under the control of national oil companies. Those national oil companies are going to be much less interested in market forces than in political considerations for allocating the energy. Also, in a country like Japan or the United States or Europe, the price increase which would be required to bring demand down to available supplies would be so high. I don't think it would be tolerated by a democratic government because it would mean that the rich get everything they want and the poor get nothing. That works in some countries, but in most countries not. And so I expect to see, even in Japan, probably within the next 10 years, some sort of quotas or rationing system or coupons, some sort of allocation scheme which doesn't only rely on price. I'm not so happy about that because quota systems are subject to human mistakes and to corruption and so forth. But it seems to me that that's the direction we're going.